Before we turn to our panel, we'd like to gather some of the wisdom in the room by asking this poll question. What are some of the main challenges that rural communities face? All right, we have some answers coming in here around the challenges that rural areas face. Staffing is standing out as a big challenge. Funding, being isolated, dealing with economies of scale issues or brain drains. Staffing remaining a really strong answer as folks are coming through. Limited healthcare access or poor transit and broadband. Connection issues, various financial resource issues, isolation, debt capacity. Thanks. And with that, I'm now very excited to introduce our speakers.
My name is Lourdes Germán, and as Executive Director of the Public Finance Initiative, as you can see from my bio, I've spent many years thinking about public finance in a very traditional sense before joining this role and founding the organization. And that really included helping cities, states, towns across America think about how to raise the money that they needed, when they needed it for the projects that needed resources, and doing so with the traditional set of values that one would think about in that kind of position and as a good steward and supporter of communities, which is solvency, making sure that folks had enough resources from a project need standpoint, and when they thought about the budget and what it meant to really think about being a good steward of the balance sheet. What does it take to think differently? When we consider how public finance can not only help you raise money for a community and everything that you need, including small and rural cities as we're focusing on in this program, but generally in a way that can advance and catalyze your vision for the future and place-based outcomes. And I want you to think about, like, this is a picture from a rural community somewhere in America. I'm not even going to tell you where. Think about your connection to a community like this. Have you driven through it? Do you live in one? Do you work with them? What are some of the needs and what are the resources that it might rely on? Do you have awareness of them? If we thought about everybody who lives in this community and the leaders and the entire ecosystem of actors, what might they say if we said, how do you fund all the things that we're seeing and the invisible infrastructure that we're not seeing? Let's sort of think through what might be those answers. So if we all of a sudden color coded in orange, what might be paid with what traditionally is a primary source of revenue for many cities across America, not just small and rural cities, taxes. We might see a whole lot of things, including, third spaces, areas adjacent to roads, bridges, community-based assets. And we thought, well, what else? Intergovernmental revenues, money that comes from the state or federal government, either as a shared revenue or a grant from a higher level of government. And if we were to look at the places in blue, you might say, well, yeah, maybe the higher government is providing support to that community to fund the park, to make sure we have clean water, or that we can take care of our sewer and septic systems. But then there's some lesser known, at least sort of when I was coming up in public finance and in some traditional circles, of other forms of resources and capital that really matter and can make a difference. You'll see, maybe some of those homeowners, or you see some of the purple roofs, are also going to mission-based lenders, community development financial institutions known as CDFIs, and they're receiving low-interest loans from lenders that they trust that are going to be transformative and vital when you think about projects that could really need assistance at a homeowner level, or even that could be vital to other ecosystems in case somebody's a small business owner and they're part of that ecosystem, and they're going there as a primary source for resources. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see a little bit about what approaching this community with that lens might tell us. We might see a different capital stack and composition than we might have envisioned if we're driving through or a resident or working with this community coming at it from just our lens and what we traditionally think about and know. What we're hoping with this program to test out as one of our different theories of change. Could we, by asking different questions, help leaders who are struggling either because they're running communities or they're a rural serving organization that sits on top in a vantage point that can look across multiple small and rural cities to think about an expanded vision for integrated capital? And by integrated capital, I think about, like a puzzle, all the different levers of not just traditional public finance, but also community investment, philanthropic funds that could flow into place. And if we looked at this fictitious community that we're talking about, and we said, all right, we can kind of tell that they may have these three resources that they're leveraging. What if that was approached with an expansive lens? What if they're leaving money on the table by not thinking that they have access at good rates to meet the municipal market? Could they expand their resource base if they knew a little bit or thought strategically or had access to philanthropic program-related investments or grants of an expanded character? Like a puzzle, we're looking at how do we bridge multiple forms of capital in a place so that we can really enable leaders who often feel left behind or like their resource base is constrained to think differently and more expansively and then be able to shift patterns of disinvestment with that knowledge and opportunity. And we know that this doesn't happen in a vacuum just by having awareness and education. It takes a lot more, including awareness of staff capacity, and making sure that we also think about who are the ecosystems of actors who sit in different buckets of resources and could actually pull those levers, and how do they come together and what do they need? And also whether or not there are other practice shifts that don't relate to the money that need to be strengthened, like the capacity for capital planning, the capacity for thinking through cash and other liquidity. But for today, we're hoping to engage in a conversation that to us begins to answer the question, if a community is, we can enable them to raise money with awareness of the whole in a larger picture than perhaps they're used to, could that really further a vision and desired outcomes in places that we really care about seeing succeed and positioning for the future more strongly than they sit today? And with that, I'll turn it back to Katy.
Thank you, Lourdes, for sharing that vision and some insights about what a more integrated suite of capital options there are. We know that an important part of that is CDFIs, which is one of the many reasons we're delighted that Suzanne Devenport from the Rural Community Assistance Corporation, or RCAC, is with us today. And so with that, I'll turn it to you, Suzanne, and ask you if you could please introduce yourself.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited about this conversation. I'm excited about Public Finance Initiative's interest in how can we better connect dots for rural communities. I've lived in rural places until 5 years ago when I took this position, what seems really odd. And what really led me to RCAC is rural is my culture. And I say that because nobody just thought about when I said culture where I shop or why would I live there, are none of the questions that you usually get. It really is a culture. It's about who I am as a person. And I feel like our communities, they do have a culture that is different and that they're wed to. So it was really exciting for me when the RCAC opportunity came up. I started my career as a one-man shop in rural Southeast Colorado. And by becoming parts of networks, my whole world became expanded of how, as Lourdes talked about, how can we leverage additional resources to make a difference in our communities? I had worked in several places where I coexisted with urban, no offense to our urban folks, but I really just wanted to go someplace where I could think about and all of the resources were directed towards rural and indigenous communities. And that's how I landed at RCAC. So who is RCAC? We are a CDFI, but we are also a technical assistance provider. We are a one-stop shop. We really value our technical assistance. It's one thing to be a leader. It's another to understand all of the levers that you need to touch and how you really bring a community together. Financial resources, we provide pass-through grants, and obviously we have our CDFI where we do loans. And then advocacy, it's really the community voice and elevating that on the national state level, particularly in this environment. In fiscal year 24, we closed 84 loans totaling $75 million. Our environmental team completed over 1,000 water, wastewater, solid waste, and community engagement projects. 303 of those were Indigenous focused. Housing provided technical assistance to mutual self-help grantees, completing 504 homes. And our Building Rural Economies team, which is our economic development arm, completed 83 projects, coached 52 businesses, and 33 of those projects were Indigenous focused. So why would a CDFI care about public funds? 50 to 60% of our lending incorporates public funds somewhere in the lifeline, whether it's pre-development, whether we are doing the construction and there are permanent takeout, whether there's a guarantee, USDA, SBA, all of the above. The majority of our technical assistance is resourced from public funds. So that is a risk mitigation tool for our lending. The better informed and the better that leaders in rural communities understand the project and all of the opportunities as well as responsibilities, the lower the risk for us to make a loan. Just as an overall, you can see we serve the 13 Western states, including Alaska and Hawaii. We work in rural and indigenous communities, and we have a diverse loan portfolio as shown in our pie chart. But I want to just give one caveat. I think our Building Rural Economies team is particularly interesting, especially when we think about public investment. We have two sides of the house. One is where we work with rural and indigenous communities to do asset mapping. Instead of bringing in a big business and giving them all the tax breaks, and then they disappear and the community's in a worse place 10 years down the road, what are the assets that they have in community that they can then leverage and build an economic ecosystem that really fits their community rather than the opposite, making their community fit what the big economic driver is. And then we also do a lot of one-on-one business coaching with cohorts in a certain geography.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for sharing your story and the work of RCAC. It's clear that you offer so much to rural areas, and really thrilled to learn from you today. And thank you for joining as a member of our advisory council for the Rural and Small Cities program. So we're excited to learn from you throughout the year. So I think as we sink in here, to please describe some of those rural areas and small cities that you've served in a bit more detail, and some of the challenges and opportunities that you see.
There is an abundance of capacity and leadership in rural and indigenous places. It often, you walk into a community or others on the outside walk into a community and they miss the memo that there's a lot of capacity. So supporting that capacity, facilitating that capacity is really important. Organizations like RCAC, we really are the bridge or the connector to a lot of those resources, adjunct staffing, if you will, the things that come up from our audience. I think the other thing I would say is if you've been to one rural community, you've been to one rural community. You cannot, we're not homogenous. We're not all ag, although that is my background as a kid, but we're not all ag. There are so many different roles that rural communities play in a larger geographic ecosystem. One of the challenges that I think we come across often is the 12 plus federal definitions of rural. It is really complicated for an organization like ours that has 275 staff that work daily in rural communities to figure out all of the minutia that goes with 12 definitions of rural and which programs are which and all of that. So if you think about, I think about Fowler, Colorado, where I started my career. You have a city clerk who's part-time. You have a public works director who also farms, who also takes care of the cemetery. You have all of these people who are leaning in. How do they figure out what 12 definitions look like? And so that's a really big challenge, is just how complex public financing can be, as well as others, and how do they connect those dots? And so I think that's a really important thing to think about when you walk into a rural community. It's just that knowledge base and the way we leverage our access or our understanding. But it's really important that the goals at that community level be the goals of that community, not a top down, but more of the grassroots. I think that's a huge issue. The other thing I think is infrastructure. That could be staff. That could also be really the infrastructure. We have a lot of conversations at Loan Fund about us loaning money for people to put things in the ground. And I always say, it's just maybe it's my country girl thing, but if you don't have that stuff in the ground, houses don't grow either. So there's this whole level of how you have to look at it very holistically. When we go in, there's not subdivisions to build houses that we can just buy a subdivision. I mean, just how providers have to do the infrastructure. The town may need help to build out their infrastructure so they can serve 12 more talks. All of that comes into play. The other thing I think is scale. Scale in rural is very different than scale in an urban place. We don't get credit in a rural community for that larger impact. Why aren't we building 50 houses? Why aren't we building 100 houses? Because that's not the impact that community needs. So if you think about scale in rural, you have to think about it past, it's only 6 units. What's that going to do? And think about it, about how that ripples through the whole community. 6 families that move in and have 3 kids each, 18 kids in a rural school is huge. So if you think about that as scale in a rural place versus big numbers that we look at in urban settings, that's a huge barrier as well. Often they're like, yeah, but are you going to scale this? No, we're not going to scale this because there's not a need for that. So I think that's really a hard barrier that we continually talk about. The other thing I would say is, as I talked about persistent poverty, 87% of the persistent poverty communities in this country are in rural places and indigenous places. So when you're working in a rural place, you really have to think about the assets that you can leverage. And sometimes the capital stack is insane because it takes a lot of knitting together. I think about a quilt. It's really putting a quilt together and where the pieces fit. And it may be a really well-pieced quilt with 1,000 different things that have to come into play. But that takes patience from all of the funders. It also takes playing nice in the sandbox. If everybody has different regulations and different criteria, pretty soon you have this much of a window to go through to make everybody happy, or you simply can't. So I think those are the things that come up in rural communities that become barriers that groups like RCAC and others on this call and outside of it have to navigate and help the communities navigate.
Oh, I'll be repeating a lot of those insights to myself throughout this next year. Thank you. Another term I've heard a lot about is technical managerial financial capacity, TMF. And we started to touch on it in that answer, but wonder if you wanted to expand a bit more on how technical managerial and financial capacity impact the ability of rural areas and small towns to take on the type of projects that might be funded. Yeah.
Honestly, the technical side is why RCAC was founded, was really in 1978, was really to be that technical fill a gap, right? Because the things that infrastructure, housing, all of that is really technical. It's really complex and it gets more complex every year. So if you think about, remember the town staff that I talked to you about? How do they figure out how a low-income housing tax credit project works? I don't even want to figure that out. And so the way that we approach it is, first of all, we want to make sure that it's community driven, that we're not coming in with, oh, here's our pat answer to how you fix your challenge. So we do a lot of community meetings, and our team is really great at not just leading and facilitating those meetings and letting things bubble up and be identified, but also we know who's at the table, who's not at the table that should be at the table. And, there's a saying that says, don't make a decision for us without us. And so thinking about that when you come into a community is really critical. They know themselves the best. They know what they need. And that might not be what an RCAC or a Suzanne or a Lourdes comes in and says, you need this. That's not what they feel like they need. And that's really critical, that respect factor. Remember I said they've got a lot of capacity. They just don't maybe know how to knit it together. And then the other thing that I would say is that funders have to understand that it takes longer to do projects, development, even sometimes come to a consensus in a rural community simply because of the nature of what they do every day. If you're a bedroom community, because that's where I grew up professionally. It's a bedroom community. So somebody might not get home until 6:30, 7 o'clock at night, and they can't come to a day meeting. So it's like figuring out how you cultivate that involvement and listening to the community, but also understanding as a funder that we don't have engineers and architects usually in our midst, which means we have to outsource that, which means they have to drive, which means that they may have to come up to speed on our county's regs, zoning, all of the things. So if you think about it, when I first started at Tri-County House in Ballard, Colorado, there had only been 3 new homes built in the county in the previous 5 years. So when I wanted to build 6 neutral self-help housing homes, it blew their minds because they didn't have the processes. That's not their fault. They didn't have the demand. So if we're going to do something that increases demand or is going to increase, we have to understand that patience and patient capital is really important. You know, like grant funding. We can get grant funding to do something in a rural community. And I will tell them from the start, you're going to give this to me for a year, but you're going to give me a couple of extensions, right? Because there's no way we're going to do pre-development on Polanco parks with farm worker owners, all of the education that has to come up front before they actually are ready to do pre-development. So I think patient capital and also just thinking about the restrictions. I always say, but why? But why do you require that? Is it something self-determined from the funder? So I think having a voice that pushes back on behalf of the community or says, this is how we can make that work. Can we do this? That's really important. And that's where the bridge and the connector is. We want to know what the community wants and what their needs are. And we know what the resources that are available. And how do we connect those and bridge them?
Wow. RCAC is just such a strong supporter to have in the states that you work, and would love to close this part of the questions to you asking about some of the shifts that you're seeing in rural communities as a result of your investments and any success stories that might be inspiring you.
One of the things that I think we really work on in our communities, and we've worked on as an organization, honestly, is how you shift from a scarcity lens. The sky is falling, we have no money, to just a like, what do we have, right? Like, what can we access internally that maybe isn't even related to financial resources? I built a golf course one time in one of my very first projects. County had the land, the city had the land, they had the water. One of the farmers had a nephew who designed it, and costs were enormous, but the farmers all had the right equipment. We built it with farmers. It was $100,000 golf course. So when you think about that scarcity versus that WealthWorks model of what do we have? What is it that we have? And really do that asset mapping that our team leads and facilitates so well. It's really important. So a couple of examples. Falcons Landing in Idaho. It's a city of 16,000 outside of Boise. It was the first major affordable housing development in 20 years. We provided an $11.1 million construction loan and helped navigate a really complex financing process. Remember that crazy stat? We know we're creating housing. We know all of that, but it's the stories that really matter. So there's a young mom named Jessie. She had a $17 an hour job. It didn't allow her many housing options. Falcons Landing transitioned her family. They're settled into their new home. They have a garden. They've started saving to be a homeowner in the future. That story really warms my heart because it really impacted a family and their trajectory. If you read all the stuff, kids who have stable housing, what they do in school, health, social determinants of health, all of that. The second one is a more expansive, Globe, Arizona. So impressive. We took our board there. The mines had dried up. Again, that was an extractive economic system. Community really needed change and revitalization. We were doing water work there. The water folks, the enviro folks, connected them to our building rural economies team. They utilized the WealthWorks model to really highlight the strengths, not the scarcity, the strengths. They trained cohorts of small business owners, entrepreneurs, and really thought through and talked through resilience. How do you build a resilient ecosystem, economic ecosystem? They helped them develop a strategic action plan to catalyze the tourism campaign. And so the impact on Glow, and you can look it up, there's been a ton of stories. So if you're curious, they secured $217 million plus in investment resources since 2018. This time the sky is falling. What are we going to do? We have nothing we're going to do this. They also had two really strong catalysts, and that's always really important. Their increase in tourism-related tax revenue continues to expand every year. They've started doing events that are bringing people, because they're more up in the mountains, so from the valley. They've raised $1 million to turn a historic building into a co-working space and a visitor center. The community pool reopened after a decade of closure. Think about the benefit to mental health for parents of the pool reopening. They've made really focused improvements to the police department, their bridges and their water and sewer infrastructure. They're doing a new housing complex. They've restored their museum. It is really, I don't know that I've ever been prouder walking into a community with the staff who catalyzed that and our board, and listening to the leaders in that community talk about what a difference it made.
You've sold it. I want to visit that community. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you. We'll turn now to Lourdes Germán, the Executive Director of the Public Finance Initiative. And Lourdes, recognizing your immense expertise, I've been wondering throughout Suzanne's talk about how the challenges and opportunities that she's explained could be addressed with a public finance lens, specifically turning it over to you about considering how public finance might help us shift some of the barriers that small and rural communities are facing to access the resources.
No, absolutely. And first, I want to start by underscoring Suzanne, like there's so many points that you made. I was like, yes, yes. We're in so much agreement there that I want to elevate that are really relevant to the answer to this question. But the first that I want to underscore is really our shared belief in just what you said, communities know what they need. You have to approach those conversations with respect rather than saying, here's a prescriptive solution, but really starting by saying, like, what matters here? What's important? What's your vision? What's missing? And then approaching the conversation from, as we often do, meeting people where they are. And I think that recognition tied to something else you said, which is no two communities are the same. As much as we can say, oh, this is what a rural community is, this is what a small city is, and we can have a shared sense of challenges. But that unique character is vital to considering the public finance piece, because as you said, every community is different from the way that you experience it, and even the residents who live there and their nexus to that community. Every community is going to have a different framework of fiscal governance. Whether or not they can do any of the things we can put on a chart or that we could put in a one-pager or teach in a capacity building session, they will know, well, actually, our state doesn't let us do that, or we can do that, but with all these restrictions. And it's going to be unique. Like even within the same state, you could have multiple cities, urban and rural, who experience that framework of fiscal governance differently, both behind what they're enabled, how special laws change, enabling authorities for unique jurisdictions, but then also their capacity to engage with those instruments in history. And beyond that, a whole host of other factors can really impact like the well of opportunity of like what we can do in reality. And part of the way that public finance and an awareness of at least like all of the arrows in your quiver as they are enabled in your state and for your context can make a difference is also tied to something else that you mentioned, which is rural communities don't get credit for a lot of the work that they do. Like even as you were describing the Globe example, the economic impact from the tax-based perspective was really real and documented. would anybody think to go back and say, actually, when we see a shift in the revenue base, let's look at this project. Let's make sure that we credit that because this happened, we now can look at a trajectory of taxes. It's going to look really different. And that's not just a conversation that is about what did we invest in the project, but that's a conversation that could approach a rural community by saying, what is the generative lens we can add here? And where are we not seeing stories about that contribution that then sets up the fiscal base to grow where it was contracted or to have different dimensions that could really be very positive and support a whole host of other outcomes. So to more targetedly, get at Katy's question, when we think about the life cycle of assets, they're going to need more than one type of investment, and particularly in communities that are constrained. So when you think about building that affordable housing, how might that impact, in Fallon's Landing, the invisible infrastructure for sewers? Might it occasion a need to think about the way that road repairs might be different if you have a whole host of individuals who are using the adjacent third spaces around that community? And planning for that life cycle replacement, life cycle maintenance is really vital. And often when you think about what it takes to put together the capital stack, even for like an affordable housing project, the money for all those ancillary assets that are not within the developer's domain and on their radar at the time of construction are going to be really important for somebody to think about. And often this is where we can consider what is the role of capacity building and support that a mayor might need, particularly when public officials that are not just in rural communities, but also small communities might not be full-time employees, even in their roles of great responsibility. One story that comes to mind is when we were doing a prior program with the National League of Cities, it really set the foundation for us to become aware of some of the issues that created the inspiration to do this. We talked to a mayor of a 176 person rural community in the state of Nevada. And we had a one-on-one phone call. She said, can you just explain to me what is a bond? What is that instrument? And we went through kind of a conversation around how that could fit in, whether she had the power to do it. And she said, I'm a full-time teacher at the high school and I'm running the city. You think about what support might she need that's really different than a 50,000 person community or a 40,000 person community where the public official at least is a half-time employee or full-time employee and has a team. And she had nobody. She wore, beyond being mayor, high school teacher, full-time roles, multiple, to really keep that community and its engine going. And that's, I think, where the uniqueness of saying, how do we enable that person and somebody of greater capacity, time, expertise, who is resourced differently, to have equal access to what we know is possible? And so that they can look at the patchwork and the quilt they can put together and feel that there's at least a pathway towards greater opportunity. And I think if we do that, you can also create expansion towards, maybe not immediately, but when you think about a time horizon that can also contemplate that investments take time and could align to the life cycle of assets, the ability to think through, well, what will my sewer system need in 5 years? And could I expand more aggressively to other forms of capital once I start to at least experiment with different entry points? So it's a little bit about why we're so excited, particularly to also highlight the importance of CDFIs. Often, even in the most sophisticated public finance conversations with large cities, we've found that there's a dearth of knowledge about the way to unite community investment with public finance. There are some cities that are doing great at it, including Detroit and others, for example, but particularly in the rural space, Craft 3 is doing incredible work in Idaho, Washington, and other states, but often these stories are lesser known, or they have less of a pathway that people say, oh, I know how to do that. I would know how to think through how to access, this incredible well of resources and unite them with my public finance priorities. And we think there's a really strong opportunity there, particularly where we think about the sectors that CDFI serve, that public finance also can really come in as a secondary engine: water, sewer, housing, and many others. So Katy, I'll turn it back to you, but Suzanne would also love your thoughts and reflections on any of that as well.
I think you've hit on a really strong point. CDFIs, community development financial institutions, are such a hidden resource, even though some of these, we try to yell it loud for the people in the back, right? Like we are a powerhouse. I think our relationships with banks sometimes help with that because they invest in us, they get CRA. But there's still also this whole thing of, oh, well, somebody almost always asks me, oh, so you take bigger risks? No, we have different risk mitigants that we can employ. we make loans where banks may not be comfortable making loans. That doesn't mean the project isn't, that doesn't mean that it's not strong. It's that we also have a technical assistance arm that can help build that project into something strong, or that can add on from our building rural economies team or our housing staff. We also develop housing alongside communities because, as I mentioned earlier, why should one person for one project do the brain drain, right? Like, it's brain damage to do those. So we come up beside them. And so I think on the CDFI side, I think understanding, and I would love to talk this through with finance initiative, especially now that you put me on your advisory committee, like how can we leverage each other's Rolodex, tells you how old I am, to really work together on building that platform of this is an opportunity for both sides of the equation. And you know, just like the person who asked you what a bond is, that's a common question. That's not, I was on school board for 20 years. I knew we had to pass a bond to build a new school, but I don't know that our town would ever have thought of it as a tool. So I think there's an education, there's also an elevation of communicating how these can work together, and just really diving into the fact that CDFIs also do a lot of technical assistance on the lending side. It's not uncommon for us to say, let us help you put your financial statement together. And so I think it's like anything. If you don't know about it, or if you're unsure, I'm reluctant to put my head in because I don't know what I'm doing. And so I think that whole technical assistance side and elevating the opportunity so that it's digestible by that single individual who's running a town or a water system or has a dream or a housing project is really important.
And I want to touch upon one really important piece that Suzanne, you brought up, which is this notion of risk. You know, one of the reasons why we're elevating and trying to build education around and test program-related investment and the role that that could play in expanding market access, particularly for rural serving organizations that have been in public finance. They know how to be facile with lending instruments, but to see could that help them grow the base of resources that they then can lend back to rural communities, and couple with these other investments from CDFIs and almost expand the spectrum of lending, because I think you're 100% right in the way we see the world. The more you know, and really approaching awareness without judgment and saying we're here to educate is important, but then it's really being attentive to the fullness of ancillary factors that somebody might need to then be ready to both say, I'm moving from learning to action, and I'm also able to think about what's appropriate for the community, and meet what many investors have as a bias. When they look at all rural communities or small communities, it's the same.
So I think one of the things that we really lean on heavily is relationships. Our TA providers create relationships in communities. And by doing that, then they are able to kind of open the window of opportunities and also provide the technical assistance on the hoops that you need to get through so that you can be successful in accessing that funding, whether it's public, whether it's, and honestly, I know how many emails I get a day. I can't imagine like that mayor that is also the school teacher, right? So how are they supposed to know unless there's a conduit, unless there's someone that they trust that says, hey, the state of California has this SAFER program that we can use to access resources for your community. So I think it's about public finance, understanding CDFIs, and CDFIs understanding public finance. As I said, 50 to 60% of our lending is connected to some kind of public finance. That's why we can do the volume we can, because we can't do that. We don't have long-term money. We don't have the interest rates that some of the public finance money does. So I think it's even more broadly about who can we make an ambassador in those communities, or that has a lead to those communities, if it's not our CAC staff or other RCAC staff or the Partners for Rural Transformation staff. how do we educate and build ambassadors so that when they do have an idea or do have a challenge, that they have access to a connector to resources? Because often it feels helpless and hopeless, and they really don't know where to turn. So I think there's a lot of ways that we could be better advocates and stewards of the resources that we can bring to.
Yeah, agree 100%.
Thank you. This has been such an insightful conversation. There was a question that came in about how CDFI rates compare to credit unions or banks, or how CDFIs can keep costs low.
Pricing is something we talk about almost every day. We were able to maintain our rate at 5% throughout COVID. In the last 6 months, we've had to increase it 0.5%. The way CDFIs get capital, just to clarify if people aren't sure, is that we actually get investments based on our balance sheet from banks at a lower rate. In return, they get CRA credit for where we loan them money. We add a spread. So at one point, when we were at 5%, our cumulative interest rate was 2.14, something like that. It's now up to like 2.8. So our spread, we've scrunched it a bit so that we can minimize risk, and also not only minimize risk to us, but minimize risk to our communities where we work, because higher interest rates create risk for them as well. Our rates, now I'm not going to say all CDFIs are that. Everybody has a different business model. So I would say that some are risk rated. So if it's a riskier deal, just like banks do and the credit unions, we are regulated by the CDFI fund and we're certified. So there's a whole nother can of worms that we live in and need to navigate. But for the most part, either philanthropic or bank funds come to us based on our balance sheet, based on our portfolio, based on our waterway of loans that we're looking at, and are priced accordingly, or what we can negotiate. We are always about negotiating lower interest rates based on we have a strong balance sheet that we can leverage.
We have another question about the disinvestment from the federal government that is pushing some responsibilities towards local governments. And just an open-ended question here about where will that capacity be added from, right?
That's multi-billion-dollar question. What I would say is I think organizations like RCAC, while we have some impact, a friend of mine that ran a housing organization in the San Joaquin Valley told me one time during the housing crisis that this was the moment that he had planned for his organization's entire career. Organizations like RCAC that provide technical assistance and CDFIs, it's been a continual goal to reduce our dependence on government financing and government funding. At RCAC, we've done that significantly in the past 5 years. However, it's not like just the federal funding is impacted, right? Or the state funding, or there's also an impact on some of our philanthropic partners. There also may be an impact on the appetite for banks to invest in CDFIs. It's a crazy environment right now. So I think the capacity for rural communities, my challenge as the CEO at RCAC and our challenge as a mission-based organization is to be creative, to be entrepreneurial. What can we do that's fee for service? What can we do to bring resources back to sustain our staff that is so critical to us being able to provide capacity support in rural communities and to be that bridge and that connector? I think philanthropy is going to probably have to look at their business models, which are very different. I learned since all of this has been happening, I learned that most foundations, if I ask them for a PRI, which Lourdes mentioned, which is an investment in our loan fund, that comes out of their core. So versus their grant money in a lot of foundations. I didn't know that. So if you think about that, if I'm asking for money that I can lend out in community that has some risk to it, then they're not as sure they want to do that, right? But if they give me grant money to do it, I can recycle it, but it's going to be smaller. So there's all sorts of things that I think organizations are going to have to figure out that are in the rural community support and development area. And for me, the financial resources we provide are really important. Our CDFI is really important. But I will say this, my most important asset and RCAC's most important asset is our team, our human assets, because they know what they're doing. They have the relationships. So my number one priority is to not lose that capacity, because however it looks in the future when we bridge, I want to make sure that we maintain our capacity so that we can be that bridge, no matter what it looks like, and not default to scarcity as we look forward.
That's a great place to wrap. Yeah, Lourdes, do you want to say a few more things as we close out?
No, just in 30 seconds, I'll add that, not everybody is feeling the same level of hurt for the disinvestment. Some states are actually doing quite well with their revenues, where their dependency was lower. And we have to really ask whether those states and counties who have not been hit as hard as small communities can actually step up and think about their role in enabling change and sort of shifting the resource base so that they can actually support communities who are really struggling through this moment where they've not been hit as hard. And also considering with the PRI discussion, what do we do to expand market access on the best terms so investors come to the table when you need them?
Great. Well, with that, we'll say thank you very much, Lourdes and Suzanne, and thank you all for joining us. Sign up if you're interested in learning more. Thank you, everybody, and have a great afternoon.